Hey folks, I'm Chris and I'm your Commander Mechanic, and welcome to another episode of Let's Do a Brew. And today I'm joined by a special guest, my dear friend Andrew, otherwise known as MTGMUDDSTAH. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And we've been trying to sit down and talk for an episode for a little while, so I'm really glad that we've been able to connect because I've got to say, not only are you a friend, but I have been a big admirer of your content for years and years. You're really one of the pioneers in recorded gameplay content. For anyone that's living under a rock, can you let us know who you are and where we can find you?
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube at MTGMUDDSTAH, on Twitter under the same handle, and on Discord and Facebook, basically. I try and keep it consistent just to simplify things, but that's where you'll find me. I post videos on YouTube twice weekly, Mondays and Thursdays, and sometimes I stream, and sometimes I do additional videos. And yeah, it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward.
And you have produced years and years of narrated gameplay content. You've
hmm
you have how many episodes at this point?
Over 1,000.
Over
I've published over 1,000 videos at this point. I mean, it's 2 a week, 52 weeks in a year. So I've been doing this, I think it's nearing, I'll say almost 8 years of doing this, like 2 videos a week at least,
wow.
and probably 10 years of doing this in general. So it's getting there. It gets up there pretty quickly, surprisingly.
Yeah, no kidding. You have to have seen just about every kind of deck and every commander on the channel with that much gameplay. What's it like to have that kind of breadth of experience in this format?
You say that, but I honestly, I mean, there's perpetually, and I'm not just saying this with the release cadence, but there's always new stuff, and there's always new ways that people can surprise you with stuff. And like I've played Edgar Markov a billion times, and then my buddy Max decided to make Edgar Markov focusing only on changelings, and kind of just, I was like, I haven't seen that yet. That's awesome. And so it's just stuff like that where your expectations are subverted just by the creativity of someone who doesn't necessarily want to do the same thing that everyone else has done, and it can be a pleasant surprise. And just it can turn something that would normally be, I don't want to say eye rolling because that sounds dismissive of people who enjoy Edgar Markov, but something that you might not necessarily sit down and think, oh great, this is going to be a lot of fun, into something that is actually fun in the long run. And it's nice. It's a real treat.
Yeah, it's nice to see those molds broken once in a while
hmm
for sure. Not the same
Yeah.
deck list every time, not the same
Yeah.
kind of thing. But I think one of the real benefits of all of that content that you've created is that if anybody is looking for gameplay of a specific commander, all they've got to do is do a search, and one of your gameplay videos is going to show up because
Very possible. Yeah.
you've got videos of just about every commander out there, every deck out there. And I know that there are more and more added and more added, but really, I've got to say, you've been an incredible resource to this community, to everybody who plays this format, to see decks in action, to see gameplay. And in a real twist, the truncated format, the narrated format that you do the videos means that it's a 10 or 15-minute video as opposed to
hmm
an actual play where it can be a 90-minute, 2-hour game. You make this and gameplay content so accessible to people.
I try to. I mean, it was the brainchild of it was, I was watching, for a bit of a deep dive, if you want to look into it, there's a channel called Gameplays by
Oh,
Clonehead.
yes.
And there was also, not Into the 99 because it's a podcast, but their logo was the Sensei's Divining Top, and I'm kicking myself for not remembering it right now because I feel like I'm doing them a disservice.
Mm.
But they had a gameplay channel where they did the same thing as well, where they basically had very narrated, quick, short videos. And I used to watch those on my way to work because I'd be on a bus for 10 minutes, then I'd be underground in the metro for 10 minutes, and then I'd be on another metro. And I never had a dedicated period of time where I could be like, let's sit down and watch a long game. Not that I didn't love those, because I love the David McDarby videos from old times on Star City Games, but it was something I thought I really like, and I'd like to try doing it. And the result of a back injury gave me a lot of free time. So I started dabbling with it and seeing where it could go.
And it's great that you bring up influences like gameplay by Clonehead. They are one of my favorites and one of the reasons why I got back into this format altogether. And one of the reasons why I have my love of clones as it is. Notoriously, their clone count in all of their videos. Absolutely love that. And I'm glad that comes up as an influence here. And what's it like for you to now be the influence for so many creators in this sphere?
Kind of surreal, kind of weird. I'm not entirely comfortable with that aspect of it. The fact that it's a business and it's become kind of more serious than me just farting around with a bunch of friends and having fun is something that I still struggle with on a daily basis. It's cool, and like I'm happy to always talk to people about it. I get about 2 or 3 emails a month asking me like little tips or tricks or things like that, and I try and share the glimmer of information that I might have come across, because it's all self-taught, and I'm not the most efficient person when it comes to editing or any of these things. So it's surreal, I think, is the only word I can use it to describe it fully.
Yeah, well, with this kind of catalog and this kind of portfolio of content behind you, you are without a doubt the subject matter expert when it comes to gameplay and this format. So I'm glad that we're able to sit down, because we had talked about an interesting concept for discussion around updating one of your favorite decks, what I would consider one of your signature decks, your Tristani deck.
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's always fun to update a deck with new cards, but sometimes it's worth trying things that are new just to see what you can improve, and not only that, just to sort of even gain appreciation for what you had. Tristani has been one of my staple decks ever since I kind of brainstormed it with my friend Harry in New Jersey, after seeing he made a Kineos and Tiro 4-color, not including black, Reanimator deck. And so Tristani kind of was the brainchild inspiration from that. I've changed her over the years. At one point, I tried her with the commander Ghired, who populates on attack, but it just didn't quite click. I didn't like being stipulated by having to attack to get one populate. So it kind of converted back into her, and then I changed things up. And funny enough, the new card that's got me tempted is the new Ghired again. Or Ghired. How do you pronounce his name?
I've always pronounced it Ghired.
Okay.
Whether that's right or not, I'm sure that they'll correct us in the comments if that's not right. But I've always pronounced it Ghired.
Okay, that's sort of what I was doing as well. So it's nice to know that I'm not alone, at least in being wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Never alone in being wrong. And there's nothing more than what the audience likes to do than correct our pronunciations. So so there's that. Like, this is very interesting, because you're taking what is a 2-color deck, a Celestia green and white deck, and potentially adding in another color to it to put this new commander at the helm. Let's first cover what makes Ghired so intriguing.
Like, the issue I have with Tristani is that you can only populate with her once. And I don't run a ton of populate cards, just insofar as oftentimes they're either very expensive for what they do, or that they're just kind of awkwardly costed, just not going to help me forward my board state. So having commander that's got the ability built into them to make tokens is what I think is probably very, very valuable, because it's exactly what the deck is going to want to do. I also found that with Tristani, you're kind of pulled in 2 directions. She has her populate, which is for tokens, and she has her life gain, which is like a pseudo win con in and of itself, because anytime there's life gain, you obviously want to run something like Aetherflux Reservoir as like a silver bullet to sort of finish a game. And that can lead to card inclusions you might not want to do outside of tokens. Like, there's some life gain cards that I've got in the deck that just function well with her, that don't really contribute more to the rest of the deck.
Right.
And so with Ghired, it feels more like a blank slate, basically, where I can kind of just really focus on tokens. And he also has a bit of an ability that requires a few hoops to be jumped through. Like, he's not just straightforward, like, creatures you control have tap, make a token. And it's like, I like having building restrictions, because it can lead to more enjoyable lines of play. And also, it can make you include cards you might not necessarily normally do. Like, immediately, as soon as I saw his ability, I'm like, Seance would be a fantastic card in this deck. I love playing Seance. It's a really weird card. I know it's memey, but it's just like, it works beautifully, I think, in this deck.
Yeah, and I think that you really hit on what attracted me to this too, is that Ghired points in one direction, as opposed to having 2 potential avenues and looking for the overlap and synergy between token making and life gain. Ghired really just says, make tokens.
Yeah, make tokens, do it, go, enjoy, have fun.
Right.
The end.
And Ghired is interesting because he's got a few caveats on this ability too. You mentioned having to
Yeah.
jump through some of these hoops. And I like that because that makes you really think about deck building. Unlike some kindred commanders that care about just a creature type, where you're just loading the deck full of everything of that creature type. You mentioned Edgar Markov. I promise no future shade on Edgar Markov for the rest of the episode. But if you just load up a deck full of vampires, then you don't really think about the deck building. With this, you need to consider only non-token creatures get this ability. So you've got to pack the deck full of non-token creatures. This doesn't make the original token. You're only making a copy of a token that entered the battlefield this turn. So you need other ways to make the first token to start making more. So there's immediately two options right there that you need to be considering for this deck list. How do we include non-token creatures? How do we make sure that we're making tokens with other cards? And I would add another dimension on top of this is because you want your non-token creatures to have this tap effect, we can really lean into Red's ability to grant things haste or have haste creatures to make more tokens. Ghired has haste on his own by himself, but the rest of the non-token creatures you'd include in this list don't necessarily.
Well, this is a fundamental issue that I often have with Tristani, and it's not a criticism per se, but you go about, especially in Tristani, making these token copies of creatures that normally don't have the ability to be made into tokens. And then they just sit there. And like, it's cool, but you're telegraphing what you're trying to do. And it gives people a lot more time to respond and interact with your plan. And that's like, don't get me wrong, interaction is good. I'm never going to be upset if someone like stops me, but giving the people like additional time to try and stop me, just especially with how fast things can be sometimes in some games, doesn't feel great. And so red having haste, especially with a card like, let's say, Anger, which is one of my favorite red cards, just because it does so much for such a little investment of just like dumping it in the yard, you can really, I don't want to say become like a threat, but do you know what I mean? Like your deck will suddenly become a little bit more aggressive as a result of this. It'll be more powerful. It'll be more combat oriented, which I find that I want to do more of. I find combat is something a step people tend to skip, and it can lead to some good chip damage, which will change the way the game plays by incremental amounts.
Yeah, it makes games snappier when you're able to head right to the red zone immediately. And the tokens that are created from this ability that Ghired grants everything don't have haste either. So haste just means if you made a token that has haste because of the ability that created it, and the token itself doesn't have haste, and you create a copy of the token, that token doesn't have haste because the token that you're copying didn't have haste. The ability that created it gave it haste. So if you include effects in your deck that give everything haste, then it means you can make these tokens, potentially make a bunch of these tokens, and immediately send them to combat. Right.
And in addition to that, red also has a lot of really great ways to make tokens.
Yes, yeah. That's the thing that I love about red. I mean, I have not made aspersions to my love of making clones and making copies of things. And red has so many ways to do this. So did you find in just the Selesnya deck, the green-white deck, that making copies of things was difficult?
It could be. I mean, you relied heavily on very specific cards. And the problem is that as soon as those cards got removed, a lot of the power of the deck was kind of neutered. And basically, red gives you, again, without kind of criticizing white and green, more. And it gives you better ones in the sense of all of a sudden, a lot of the tokens you might have haste until end of turn. You do lose them, but you at least get to use them to a more aggressive stance right off the bat, which I find is probably very welcome to most people.
Yeah, and that's something that I really do want to make sure that we touch on here, is that red adds in this ability to create temporary tokens rather than permanent tokens. Some of the green and white effects that make you a token copy of something might make you a permanent token copy of something. But red says exile this at end of turn.
Exactly.
Which is very interesting because some of the options that we can add in here actually exploit this or use this as a loophole. For instance, there are cards like the new Molten Duplication, for instance, that create a token copy of an artifact or enchantment that you can, or sorry, artifact or creature that you control. and you sacrifice it at the end of turn. Note that that sacrifice effect is specific to the card that created the token and not the token itself.
Yeah.
Compare that against Heat Shimmer, which is a similar effect, but the token gains the sacrifice this at end of turn. Meaning, if we use Ghired's ability to make copies of the token, if we make copies of a Heat Shimmer token, we have to sacrifice each of those tokens at end of turn. If we make copies of a Molten Duplication token, then we only have to sacrifice the copy that was created by the Molten Duplication. It's a very interesting loophole.
Yeah, there's some fun tweaks that you can kind of like play around with and get maximum advantage out of. And that's just like it. It adds another dynamic to what you want to be doing, which is just kind of making cool tokens of things that are not normally traditionally tokens, and then like getting enter the battlefield effects or getting additional punchy phases. So I mean, like it's just there's a layer of complexity added as a result of adding the third color beyond just having to have 3 types of mana on your board.
Well, I think one of the other really interesting aspects of Ghired's ability here, unlike Tristani, is that you can make copies of non-creature tokens that enter the battlefield too, where populate is just creature tokens.
Exactly.
So this means that if you create a token copy of an artifact, let's say you'd make a token copy of a soul ring, you can now use Ghired to make a bunch of soul rings. And all of your non-token creatures can now be essentially pumping you out a soul ring on every tap. That gets pretty wild.
And I mean, like, that's it. It's just, it adds lines of play that you would not traditionally have seen. And it's also just kind of nice that he grants the ability to other creatures. You're not just limited to him being the only one who can do it. If you have like a mana dork out and you're like, I don't need this mana, all of a sudden that mana dork can turn into, like you said, making a treasure, making a soul ring, making for whatever. I mean, one of my favorite cards, Ulvenwald Hydra. Like it's just it gives you so much variety and just kind of fun. And that's really what I want in a deck for the most part, is just not to be doing the same thing over and over and over again. Not again that there's anything wrong with that, but for me, I want different lines of play. I want dynamic, unforgettable games that happen and just do silly stuff sometimes. And it can just be too easy to fall into a habit of doing the same line over and over again. I'm guilty with it with even Tristani. I will always go for Ulvenwald Hydra. It's my favorite card in the deck. It does land ramp. It gives me so much life and it becomes a huge body. And it's just too easy to sort of like stick to that same process. Whereas this, I find everything changes each time you make a new token. You have to reevaluate what you're doing. You have to reevaluate what you want to make, how you want to tap. Do you want to use your mana dorks to tap for mana, or do you want to use them to make tokens? Like, it's just, there's complexity that makes it more enjoyable.
Right. And with the variety of things that you can do with an ability like this, with what we can include in the deck, every game can be different. You might find yourself making, 10 copies of a token in one game and then 20 copies of an entirely different token the next game, and seeing how that impacts it. And again, it could be an artifact one game. It can be a creature the next game. It could be an enchantment in the third game, if you can start creating token copies of these things. And to me, that's what I love. It's not about what is the straight line to a win. It is, how do I get wacky with this?
Yep. How do I do cool stuff? How do I make everyone be like, wow, that was neat? Or like, I've never seen that interaction before. And that to me is like, that's invaluable. And just in terms of like memorable plays, like I've won with Tristani, I'll say like a couple dozen times, but it's the ones where it's just like I'm at 1 life and then suddenly I jump up to 120, or I'll make a Phyrexian processor and then I'll pay like 99 life into it to make a 99 horror, and then I'll sacrifice it to Altar of the Dementia to mill someone out. And it's just these like weird, funky lines that are just fun and neat, and everyone, like, hopefully everyone at the end of the day is like, that was really cool. I want to play that again.
Right. And that's the real goal of Commander. And it's really interesting that we mentioned this, because a lot of people might head into a game saying, my goal in Commander is to win this game. People like you and I have this opinion of the goal of Commander is to come back for a game 2, for somebody to say, I want to play against that again, or I want another game with you. So we can at this point diverge in two directions. We can cover what is expected to be in this deck, what a lot of people would include in a deck like this. And the other direction is, what are some of the weird out of left field cards that we can include in a deck like this? Which way do you want to head?
Let's go with the weird cards. I like that. I like that. I find, like, I mean, the reality of it is we have so many resources. We're very spoiled for choice in terms of getting recommendations for what is traditionally included in the deck. What I find sometimes is lacking is a card. I played against Celestial Toymaker recently, which all it cares about is you as a player making piles of cards. And I saw a card like Fight or Flight, which I'd never seen before, and it was just like I went into it thinking like, okay, fact or fiction, Unesh, Sphinxes, other ways to sort of really capitalize on that ability. And then my buddy Matt played Fight or Flight, which is at every combat step he gets to make 2 piles of creatures, and I was like, that's brilliant. That is so cool.
Yeah.
It became obnoxious, but it was really cool.
Yeah, and sometimes the coolest cards are ones that you have never heard of. I'm sure for somebody that has seen as many games as you and seen as many decks as you, that it's seldom that you see a card come up that has never come up any other time, right? So anytime that something does come up, it really piques your interest.
Yeah, that's it. It tickles me, and I'm just like, I just want to see more of it in action, and it's fun.
I love to see that. Anytime somebody submits me a deck list and says, hey, can you help me with this list? And I see like a super deep cut card, I am immediately overjoyed with that. Somebody must have
big smile on your face.
Yeah, somebody must have like dug through the dollar bin at the LGS or spent hours searching in Scryfall to find that card, because nobody else would be using it in a deck like this. I love those kind of things. And that's the kind of weird stuff that I would love to include in this Ghired deck too, because as mentioned, it's not just creature tokens that you could be making lots of copies of here. And that's typically the direction a lot of people would go right away, because red and green and to some extent white can all make tokens of creatures. Let's talk about some of the cards that we might include to make tokens of other things. Okay, so one of the things that I like to do, I've got a deck built all around this. My Brutaclad Telcor Engineer deck is all about making copies of artifacts. And there are a few cards that I have earmarked that would be good in Ghired from that list. And those would be cards like Prototype Portal, Mirror Works, and even the new Nexus of Becoming. These are all incredible ways to make token copies of artifacts. And Nexus of Becoming, which is brand new from the big score out of Outlaws, has a way to make token copies of creatures or artifacts every turn. These are great ways to say, turn an Arcane Signet into a 3/3 creature, and then you get the best of both worlds. Suddenly you're defeating the table with an army of Arcane Signets. How often does that happen in a game?
Not often. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I love to see. Like, you'll see a Lannis deck where they'll play 1 billion food and 1 billion clue tokens, and then they'll cast something like Rise and Shine overloaded, and you're getting beaten to death with a clue token. And it's just like, that's, that happened.
Yeah, you can never be mad at losing in a way that is just like off the wall and unexpected like that.
Exactly.
So things like Prototype Portal, Mirror Works, Nexus of Becoming, they let you make token copies of anything, of any artifact, largely. So then what kind of artifacts would we be including in a deck like this that you would want to see us make multiple copies of?
So there's that new card. You'll have to forgive me. I can't remember her name. She is from one of the more recent sets. I think it's she's Starfall.
Oh, Roxanne?
Yeah. So she makes meteorites, which are mana rocks, but also do damage. And I think that'd be kind of funny if you were able to make like a zillion meteorites and just pummel someone to death with shocks. And just, it's stuff like that where it's these really neat lines of play that you don't necessarily, like you said, it subverts the traditional, or at least the expected way of the deck is going to be built. And I agree with you. When I looked at Ghired, I'm like, how am I going to make creature tokens? I didn't focus on the alternatives. I didn't focus on the others. And it's really, really neat.
Yeah, and again, I think that that's something that a lot of people may overlook here because everybody would immediately look at the Naya color combination and say creature
Hmm.
tokens, or they look at the previous version of Ghired and they think populate, which is only creature tokens, and they
Hmm.
gloss over the fact that you can use an Ondu Spirit Dancer to make a token copy of an enchantment and then copy that enchantment a bunch of times
Yep.
too. That's
Yep.
those are immediately interactions that my mind goes to here of
Your twisted mind.
exactly of like what enchantment would I like to see me make 6 of, right?
Yeah.
Those are the kind of cool things, and sometimes that might be as simple as I want to make 6 copies of an impact tremors, so the next time I make a creature,
Sure.
I'm just doming my opponents over and over again. But sometimes
Yeah.
it's I want to make 6 copies of that seance that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, or Legion's Landing, which is it gives your creatures myriad. I want one of my creatures to have myriad times 6. You make 6 copies of that. You swing with those, or you swing with them because their creature. It's just like
Yeah.
It's wild. I didn't even think of enchantments. That's awesome. Yeah, that's super fun.
Yeah, and that's what I'm talking about. Something like Legion's Loyalty, like you mentioned, that gives everything myriad and myriad stacks. So not
Hmm.
only is that, hey, this is an enchantment that I'd like to make multiple copies of, but further down the road, it is now making token copies that you can make copies of too. So it's one of those
Yep.
cool synergies that's like, yeah, I can set up the scenario where I can make multiple copies of this, and that sounds really fun. But then if I just want to end the game by making a bunch of creature tokens that all have myriad, I can do that too.
That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. And that's again the kind of thing that I love, and the kind of like angle to these commanders and to these creatures that come out that aren't necessarily the ones that you'll find in an EDH rack, or aren't the ones
Hmm.
that you'll see in a stock list, a quote unquote. I'm using heavy air quotes right now. Stock
Yeah.
list of somebody who's making this, right? It's these things of do you specialize in this is going to be my Ghired deck that's all about copies of
Hmm.
artifacts, or this is my Ghired deck that's all about copies of enchantments, or in some cases, this is my Ghired deck that's all about making token copies of lands for whatever reason,
Yep.
right? Because you can do that too. There are token lands, and there are cards that will make you token copies of lands too, and you can use Ghired's ability to just make multiple copies of lands, like well, what is it? It's the new Urza's land. It's Urza's Workshop, I believe it is.
Urza's Workshop. Yeah.
Yeah. So Urza's Workshop, it has Metalcraft, and if you have Metalcraft, you add colorless mana for each Urza's
Equal to
land
the
you
other
control.
ones.
So,
Yeah.
so if you make 4 copies of this and you have Metalcraft, you now have 4 lands that are each making 4 mana each. Like again, that's an angle that I really like, and I really appreciate
Hmm.
weird decks like this.
Hmm.
There's also
Yeah.
the green X spell one that makes uh Dryad Dryad Arbor lands.
Yeah. The it's like X green green or something like that, and it's you make a 1/1 Dryad Arbor. I have it in Tristani. It's fantastic. It makes lands basically, as you said, and it's a different type of token that is also a creature. So I guess it does appeal to some people
Mhm.
in the traditional sense, but it's also a little bit different, and it helps you ramp.
It's a forest. Yeah,
Yeah,
awaken the woods is the
that's
card.
it.
Yeah, create X 1/1 green forest dryad land creature tokens. So that's very much in this deck something that you can do to be like, okay, well, I'm going to now tap all of my non-token creatures to make additional 1/1 green forests. And these might
Hmm.
be as simple as on the surface Llanowar elves, right? The 1/1
Yeah,
mana dorks. But keep in
yeah,
mind that
basically.
they are lands. So that counts for landfall too. And you can go
Yep.
absolutely wild with that. With some of the wacky and wild things that we can do with this deck, which I think is really fun here. Let's talk about something that we haven't touched on, and this might be the elephant in the room, but there are a couple of infinite combos that we can put together
Of
with
course.
Ghired here too.
Yeah.
In particular, there are 2 white creatures that we can include in this deck that allow us to just pop off, and that is Midnight Guard and Village
Hmm.
Bellringer.
Yep.
So Midnight Guard untaps itself whenever another creature enters the battlefield. So as long as you are making a creature token, Midnight Guard untaps itself to make another token creature
Yeah.
to untap itself, and you make infinite token creatures.
Yeah.
Village Bellringer, when it enters the battlefield, you untap your creatures. So as long as you're making a token copy of it, you get infinite creatures. How do you feel about infinite combos like this in your personal lists?
So in my list, I will never shy away from a combo. I think combos are a great way for a game to end. I think far too often I've been in a game where I've wished people played more combos, where we've reached hour 2 or 3 and it's just board wipe after board wipe, or it's been locked down to the point of just draw, land, pass. And something like this is a welcome resolution in a lot of ways. And so I'll never say no to it. I will also never intentionally tutor for it as fast as I can, though. There's a level of restraint when it comes to something like this, where it's the same kind of concept of Kiki Jiki Restoration Angel. Like red and white have a lot of very friendly ways of all of a sudden making oops, everything has haste and everything can attack and I have a million tokens. So it's good. It's a good thing to have, yeah.
Yeah, and this is a kind of archetype, and this is a color combination where you can include those 2-card combos that are in the 99, like the Kiki Jikis and, a strong breeze will go infinite, right? And including some of those lines is great. 1 or 2 of those combos is acceptable as long as you don't beeline to them. But at what point is the saturation too much?
I would stipulate probably only running one of them. I would figure out which one I liked more, whether it works better to synergize with something like the Village Bellringer, where it untaps all of my creatures just because that is a good effect for my deck. Or if I'm just going for that one and done combo piece, would the other one do better? And it's a matter of figuring it out. I just also think that if you start to add too many pieces of combo, you run the risk of drawing 1 or 2 of the same piece and then not the others, which is also not what you want to be doing. And it's with everything, intent is a big part of my deck building. And there's also reality check. Especially I find that when I play cards and decks on camera, there's whether this is true or not, there's an element of luck. And often I'll joke and say that like my deck is being camera shy and you just it doesn't perform. And so to double up on pieces like that, I'm always worried. I'm like, I'm going to sit here with a handful of lands and Village Bellringer effects and no token copies. And so I'm just untapping my stuff, but that's about it.
Yeah, and I think that is a very important point, because Ghired himself does not make the original token that you start making copies of. So you don't have that effect in the command zone, meaning you need more of a saturation in the 99 of effects that make that first token, and less that are, once I start making tokens, this helps me win the game.
Yeah.
I like to say that that's more steak than sizzle in deck building.
Yeah.
You need more meat in the deck than things that are the icing. Like if you need 1 card to win the game, then include fewer copies of it. And instead include more cards that get you to the point that that card will win you the game. So at what point in the games that you record do you typically say, okay, it's time for a combo win? Is it when everything else has petered out? Or is there for you a good rule of thumb of, okay, we've reached turn 7 or 8, let's finish this off?
No, I would say I don't want to yuck someone's young, and I never want to prematurely end things. But oftentimes I'll stipulate with people, if we reach like an hour and a half threshold in terms of games, most people know at that point, like, I think most of the play groups that I play with, anything is on the table at that point. No one's going to be upset if after like 13, 14, 15 turns, someone finally assembles all the pieces that they need to win the game. And it's just easier, I find, for me to edit it, but also for us to sort of go into the next game without having to take a massive break. Because like a 2-hour game, you need to stretch. You need to get a drink. You need to move your legs around a little bit. Whereas I find an hour and a half is more palpable.
Yeah, sometimes you got to shake the cobwebs out after a long game like that. You tunnel vision for too long. You got to shift the mindset,
Yeah.
grab a bite to eat,
Yeah.
maybe play something in between, and then go back for
Yeah.
another game. I get that.
Yeah.
I get that. So in a deck like this, we talked about the combo win. How about cards that you would include in the deck that aren't necessarily a combo win, but are win cons?
Okay. These two of the cards that I love in Tristani, which can easily slot into this, are Sarah Emissary and Archon of Valor.
Mhm.
I think it
Mhm.
is. Let me just I double check exactly the name, but it's Archon of Valor's Reach. So these two cards are expensive. One is 7 and one is 6. But they have very powerful effects when they come in. And they basically, I would say if it resolves, you either have to die or you're going to win.
Mhm. Mhm.
So in the case of Sarah's Emissary, when it comes in, you choose a card type. And you and creatures you control have protection from that. 9 out of 10 times, I resolve this as a token. And it comes in, the first thing I name is creatures.
Yeah.
And like that sets you up to not have to worry about combat. You don't have to worry about too much at all. And then subsequent tokens become like instants, blah, 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 blah. And I lock it down. Or at that point, I usually have enough of a bodies on my field to sort of start taking people out through combat. Archon of Valor's Reach is a bit more universal because you choose between artifacts, enchantments, instant sorceries, and I think planeswalkers. You can't choose creatures, which is, I mean, I'll forgive it. But basically, no one can cast that moving forward, period. So like all you can cast is creatures if you have multiples of these out. And again, this is a big body. It's a 6/6 or a 5/6 flyer. I think it has vigilance. It's just like you're getting in for damage. It's got a powerful effect on it. And if it sticks around for more than 1 or 2 turns, I'm usually in a good position. And it's just cards like that where it's an immediate, powerful, often expensive costing effect that hits the field and it changes the dynamic of how my opponents perceive my deck. And that usually speeds up the game significantly because all of a sudden people start committing resources to taking out one person. And if they can't, they lose. And if they do, all of a sudden, a lot of their resources and their defenses are down, which makes it subsequently easier for other players to start finishing each other up, which is the kind of thing that I like to like. I'm not trying to say that I'm going to kick myself out of a game intentionally, but a play like this needs to be answered.
Somebody needs to be the archenemy at the table, right?
Right, exactly. Like you need to establish a villain at the table. I will take that role on, and it will usually make the game go faster. And as a result, again, it feeds into the other thing, which is more games, which is what I want to do. So it's just like these are the kind of cards that I like to resolve.
Yeah. Now, do you feel that the threat of locking down the table like that, preventing people from attacking, making your things unable to be targeted by different permanent types, spells, whatever it might be, do you feel like that is the incentive to get people to interact with you? Or do you
Yes.
or do you feel like maybe that can lead to scenarios where people feel like they now can't win and that's scoop territory?
I think it depends on your meta. That's a question that's really hard to sort of give a pinpoint answer on. For the most part, the people I play with, most people don't know about Archon of Valor's Reach. Like it's not a card that sees a lot of play. Sarah's Emissary more so. It's a good angel in, let's say, Kalia, but I don't think so. The attitude is usually he has to die or, okay, we're done. Let's move on to the next game kind of thing. There's no kind of, I don't find that there's a hurt feelings. It's more just I don't want to say acceptance of fate, but you know what I mean? Like it's, okay, we're done.
Yeah. Well, especially with these cards and in Ghired's deck, you can have one copy enter the battlefield and then immediately make enough copies of it to lock out everything. So opponents can only cast creature spells moving forward. You have protection from everything moving forward. That in some cases is just like, okay, well, now we cannot interact with you at all. Good game. I think that's a perfectly valid win con, in my opinion. There are going to be people that flail against it for sure. But if you reach that point where it's like, okay, I now have protection from everything. I have 6 of these angels in the air. Good game. A lot of people will just pick it up.
That's it. I think that's fair. I mean, this is what I mean where it gets to the point of like how long it's been. Like oftentimes with the cost of these commanders and these creatures, it's not going to happen turn 4. It's not going to happen turn 5 under like very, very minute, rare instances. And so stuff like this, I think if it happens, good.
Yeah.
Like, it's going to end the game. We're going to move on to the next one. You know what I mean? Like, it's fine.
Yeah. Game's got to end sometime. I think
That's it.
Perfectly fair.
We all have lives outside of the game.
we all have families to get home to, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I like these kind of win cons more than maybe the infinite combos of the Midnight Guards or the Village Bellringers, because the most expensive piece of that combo is 3 mana. And that can realistically happen on turn 4. Where if you're making copies of these massive Archons, or let's say your win con is, I want to make 10 copies of Terror of the Peaks, right? Yeah. Those are all things that are going to happen turn 5, 6, 7, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
It's going to give enough time for people's decks to do the thing around the table, so it doesn't ever feel like it's a non-game because you just popped off too quick.
Yeah, that's the important thing. I think that's the stipulation that we've kind of been circling around quite a bit, is that you don't want a non-game. You don't want this to be a source of contention where people are like, oh, okay, he's pulled out Ghired, he's in a combo off on turn 4. Like, that's not really what I want the reputation to be. I want it to be more, oh, it's Ghired, this is going to get weird. We're going to see tokens that are not normally supposed to be tokens and possibly die. And things like Seance, which I would imagine a lot of people aren't afraid of, suddenly are like, we need to think about taking this card out and not letting him resolve it, or getting at least to 1 upkeep before it gets taken out.
Yeah. Can you imagine the game where somebody looks at Seance and says, that's the boogeyman at the table?
Yeah, this is the scariest card on the table. Yeah. This is terrifying.
Exactly. That's what I love. I mean, in a game that I played on stream ages ago, I had somebody use Karn Liberated's downtick to take out, I think, harmless equipment that was just giving one of my creatures flying, because it was the most threatening thing on the table. Not my commander itself, but the fact that my commander had flying. And that is insane to me. Is like, okay, you're going to use this massive 7 mana resource, down ticket to exile a 1 mana equipment that I have. I have made that the scariest thing at the table. That's what I love about these decks.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about what to include in these decks. We talked about why you want to change the decks. We've talked about win cons for the deck. Is there anything else you want to cover?
That's a good question. That's always, I mean, there's always things that you want to cover. There's always stuff you want to talk about. I would say the thing that I often struggle with the most is there's that kind of rule of thumb with like draw, board wipe, ramp, and how much do you stick to that in terms of deck building? I find I often stray very far from it. I'm quite guilty of going too heavy in one direction often, and then having to like rein it back and balance out a little bit more. But for a deck like this, where it's such a, you have to build it in such a niche way with so many like specific cards that are not traditionally what you'd want to run. What do you do in those situations? Do you still stick to a resource where it's like, okay, you need to have 10 draw, 10 ramp, 10 interactions, 38 lands, and then whatever's left you get to put in?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of those deck building templates. I'm really of the approach of every deck needs to consider its own balance around what you want to do and what your curve looks like more than anything. So for instance, if the intent of this deck is to always get Ghired out, then you're really revolving around 3 mana. And if you're revolving around 3 mana, how much ramp do you really need to get there? And in my opinion, that's probably not going to be a lot. You aren't going to need, you aren't going to need all of the Nature's Lores, the 3 Wishes, the Far Seeks in order to get to 3 mana. You can do that pretty naturally, including just 38 lands in your deck. The big concern in these color combinations would be, in my opinion, card draw resources. How do you include enough card draw in a deck that doesn't include black or blue, which are some of the best card draw colors? So that would be, how do we include synergistic card draw? How do we include synergistic ramp? And in those, in my opinion, this would be, do we include creatures that ramp on enters the battlefield? Do we include a Farhaven Elf, for instance, so that if we make more token copies of it, we now ramp out of control? Because that ramps on its own if you aren't doing the thing yet. And if you are doing the thing, it just propels you so far ahead of the game that you can go wild with it. Those are the considerations that I would include in a deck like this. Not a strict, I need 10 pieces of removal, 10 pieces of ramp, 10 pieces of card draw.
I think that makes sense. I mean, this is kind of what I end up doing for the most part, but it's I often get people who look at the decks and are like, "Oh, you don't have enough ramp," or "Oh, you don't have," and it's those kind of things where you're just like, "Am I doing it wrong? Am I not doing it wrong?" Like it's tough to say because everyone has their different little philosophies, which I'm not trying to be dismissive when I say little because that sounds kind of, yeah. But it's just it's whether the tried and true is as tried and true as it is, or like have things changed enough to be a little bit more forgiving. And a 3-mana commander with a powerful effect is not hard to hit, like you said. It's quite easy to achieve.
Yeah, and you touch on a great point there, is that something might not work for everyone. For instance, I'm a big fan of 38 lands in my decks now. I used to be a big fan of 35 lands, and I felt that adding 3 more introduced a lot more consistency into my decks. But I have people that swear up and down that 33 to 35 lands is the gold standard in a deck. And hey, if that works for you because you have 2-mana commanders or 3-mana commanders in your roster, great. More power to you. If that works for you, that's great for you. I like the consistency in my decks around my deck building style, which is why I think that the kind of templated build standards that are floating around there don't make a lot of sense for everyone, because you're going to find your own balance for it. You're going to find your own start to it. And the best way to do it is to just play games and find out where your weak points were. Oh, I didn't have enough card draw in this game. Oh, I couldn't reach 3 mana this game. That's your deck telling you what you should change about it. I need to add in some ramp. I need to add in some draw. I need to add in some lands, whatever it might be. In a deck like this, it might be, oh, I made it to that game and I only had 3 non-token creatures out the entire game, really limiting how I could pop off from this. I should add in more non-token creatures into my list.
Yeah, I should reassess. I should relook at what's going on and try and figure out what's working and what's not, and what I can take out and what I can put in.
Yeah, and I would add another dimension to this and say that one game is not a definitive need to change your deck. I know a lot of people out there that will play one game with their deck and say, oh, I need to change these 10 things about it. Hold your horses, play another couple of games, find out if you're having consistently that same problem, then start making changes to your deck.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah, I have a friend of mine. I won't name him by name because I know he listens. But he was notorious for this. He would play one game with his deck. He wouldn't win. So he'd go back to the drawing board and take his entire deck apart. And I sat down with him and I said, guy, you got to find out what the inconsistencies are, because if you keep changing your deck like this, you're never going to nail down what the true issue is.
You need to test it out. You need to cast the same cards over and over again and get a sense of like, okay, is this impactful? Does this 7-mana spell actually do anything? Is it going to change the dynamic of the game? And then after resolving it several times against different opponents in different board states, then you'll start to get an assessment of like whether or not it actually makes sense to do.
Yeah, or like, did I draw this 8-mana card in my opener and never get to cast it? Is that a problem with your ramp? Is that a problem with the fact that you have that 8-mana card in your deck? Is that a matter that your meta is just too fast that you won't get to cast that 8-mana card? You really have to sit down and think about it from that angle. I think from our discussion today, we've got quite a few things to update your list with, freshen it up a little bit, and give you a few interesting directions to go with it. At the end of today's episode, I'll have that deck list for everybody. But before we go, Andrew, why don't once again you remind everybody who you are and where we can find you?
So I am Andrew. I do almost everything on MTGMUDDSTAH except for scripting the games, who my friend Harry does very nicely. I post 2 weekly gameplay videos, sometimes more, depending on what season it is. And I like to play Commander. I like to go to stores and meet new people, and that's about it.
Amazing. Andrew, thank you so much for sitting down and talking to me today. And folks, stay tuned because our deck list is coming right up. All right, folks, here's our list. Andrew and I wanted to keep some of the spirit and the parts of his favorite deck and add in some wacky angles, which I think we did pretty well. This deck can now make copies of creatures, artifacts, enchantments, and lands for a new experience every time you play it. I worked to keep some of Andrew's favorite cards in, and even left Tristani in the 99 as well. If you want to check out the full deck list, head over to my sponsor, Moxfield. Moxfield is the best deck building platform in the world, and makes it easier than ever to collaboratively edit a deck. While you're there, follow my profile to never miss a brew. And while you're here, be sure to check out these other episodes with guests. If you were inspired to brew today, hit that subscribe button. It's the law. And as always, good luck and have fun.